renewable energy subsidies going on. Really, the late 90s is when that started at the federal level, and they started putting some money into it. But Texas got in really early too. 1999, they passed the first bill that put in renewable energy subsidies. Like I told you, they came back in 2005, wanted to increase it again. I believe truly that there would be 0 wind farms, 0 battery farms, and 0 solar panels across the state on a grid level. You might find some locally for different uses, but on a grid level, they just don't make sense. They're inefficient. They cost more than natural gas to do. They just wouldn't be here. But instead, because of that, we have all these. They're just ubiquitous everywhere. And if you look up on the slide there, you can see why. So from 2010 to 2019, and you can see the amount coming in during this period of time, right? $74 billion for renewables, but only $37 billion for fossil fuels, and then about 15 for nuclear. So, and if you look at that on a per kilowatt basis of energy, I mean, it's multiple times. Brent's done some really excellent work on this, and we'll get to him in just a little bit. And then since 2020, they've just gone out of control. And the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, I believe it was, they just multiplied. You can see fossil and nuclear fuel subsidies are going down, with fossils in particular, but the renewables are just going up. That's why we have all these wind farms around the state of Texas. So here's this is what Texas looks like, and it tells a story, and I'll try and be quick with all these numbers. But if you look at that, you go back to 2014, and that's really when experts in Texas, 2012, 13, but it was really 2014 where the experts and the regulators and the politicians in Texas started reacting to the problem with the renewables, because they saw the reliability problems that were being introduced on the grid back in those days. And you see on the left-hand panel, that's renewable subsidies. Those are both federal, state, and local renewable energy subsidies. And you can see over the years that they've just grown and grown and grown from $1 billion or so back in 14 to, I estimate, going to be about $6 to $7 billion in 2025 this year, right? It's out of control, really, what's going on with that. And you can see what's happened because of that. The percent of our total grid generation every year has grown and grown and grown until last year, it was almost 35% of the electricity we have in the state of Texas is produced by renewables. You can see in the next column, other governmental imposed costs. You start up at the top line, and really you go back to 2013 and 12, that number's about $350 to $500 million. What that means is that those are kind of the overhead costs, because, you got to pay for people who are running the grid and all the equipment and those types of things. So you're always going to have those kind of costs. But the baseline was about $500 million. But it started in 2014, that started to increase as basically the response of Texas policymakers and Texas regulators has been, instead of going after the renewable energy subsidies, they've decided to subsidize thermal generation, natural gas, nuclear, and coal, to the extent we have any coal left. And you can see over the years how that has increased over the years, to the extent that we're at, in 2023, it's about $16 billion. Now, some of that also goes to renewables because they get caught up in that, but it's a lot of money. And you can imagine if the Texas legislature passed legislation that says we're going to impose a $16 billion electricity tax on y'all, everybody would go up in arms. But this is all happening at the Public Utility Commission and over at ERCOT and things like that. And so these costs get added into the system. And they just keep going, but they're not working, because as you look over in that final column over there, the percent of renewables of new generation. So that's all the generation that's coming online each year. You can see last year it was about 97%. This year it's estimated to be 96%. So basically nobody's building natural gas anymore. So the basic line is we can't out-subsidize the federal government, and so we need to go directly after the renewable energy subsidies, either get rid of them or compensate for them in some way, mainly by making the people who are getting those benefits pay for them. What's going on in your district that has caused you to be interested in this issue?
Thank you. You said one thing I quibble with in my bio. You said that energy reliability was a big issue for me. It really wasn't in my campaign. Not that we didn't talk about it here and there, but it wasn't a major issue that I discussed a lot, and I would not classify myself as an expert on this, although I'm trying to get up to speed. If I look and see at the great energy needs that Texas has, we have all these data centers that want to come in. We're talking about desalination plants on the coast. We need to double or triple our power capacity over the next, within this decade. And there's no incentive or a negative incentive to build dispatchable power plants because you can't sell the energy onto the grid. And so I have introduced House Bill 3017, and House Bill 3017 is a pretty simple bill. It just requires anyone receiving federal green energy subsidies to report that, how much that is, and then the state will impose a franchise tax in exactly that same amount. And so this removes that perverse incentive. It puts them on a level playing field with other with cheap, reliable energy. And this has been the case at least since the Industrial Revolution. But our ability to remain prosperous, our national security is based on our ability to create cheap and reliable power. And instead of creating cheap and reliable power, we are buying expensive, unreliable power from our geopolitical enemies, the components coming from China. There's nothing about it that's not perverse for our national security, grid reliability, and all of that. And so this is a simple bill. It's short, and it just puts things on a level playing field, and I've gotten a lot of great feedback and hope that you guys can help us push that forward.
All right, thank you very much. So Brent, you've been at this for quite some time and been focusing on a variety of issues nationally and here in Texas. Could you, before we get to what you're doing this session on some working some bills and things like that, could you give us just an overall broad background on the problems that Texas and maybe even the nation are facing on these issues?
In Texas, we've had over $130 billion in private capital so far allocated towards wind, solar, and energy storage. That's on top of the subsidies that Bill was talking about earlier. So over $130 billion. If we just spent 20 to 25 billion of that on resiliency, weather resiliency, dispatchable power, the things we needed to keep the grid secure during Winter Storm Uri, that would have been a minor event. The other states around us had minor rolling outages. That's what should have happened here. Instead, we had a whole statewide disaster. And so that's really the fundamental problem is this misallocation of capital. And it's happening all over the country. And I think it's happening even more so here in Texas because, in addition to the subsidies, we pay the same single market clearing price for energy for wind and solar and other resources. So we treat resources as if they're the same, that they have the same characteristics when they don't. As if, we treat a wind and solar farm, if you happen to produce during a peak time one time, then we pay you as if you can produce that at that time again, but you may not show up the next time. That ability to show up in the future, what we call capacity, is not valued here. And it's fine when all the resources have similar capacity values like gas, coal, and nuclear, but you have these resources with different characteristics, wind and solar, and that we don't let the subsidies just flow straight into their pockets, and then all we get is unreliable energy. So I think we at the state level have the ability to do that, and particularly in Texas because we have our own grid, we are uniquely positioned to act more quickly on this than other states are.
So, Senator, so you've introduced a couple of bills at least to try and address this. Could you kind of walk us through those and what you're trying to do in those?
Sure. Senate Bill 715 basically is, we passed some legislation last time that's going to, we've ordered the PUC to come up with some firming requirements, but it wasn't broad enough. So this bill is going to not just look at generation moving forward, but it's also going to look back at all of the current generation that we have. And they're going to be required, all those generators are going to be required to have a certain level of reliability. And so what that, that gives them the flexibility to decide how they want to do that. Do they want to do that building a bunch of batteries? Do they want to contract that out? But should they contract to provide electricity at a particular time and say the wind doesn't blow, so they can't, or it becomes a cloudy day for a solar group, they can't provide it. They've got to be responsible to go out on the market and provide that electricity to the market.
Great job, and